I must write swiftly, for I fear that the creatures that stalk this realm will discover me, and I won't be able to tell my story. My name is Daniel Carson, and the year is 1929? 2015? I don't know anymore. Time has no meaning in this place. There is no past, and the events of the future happened a fortnight ago. My previous life was uneventful. As an agent of the Department of Cryptonatural Phenomenon and Research, I was usually given less officially abnormal cases. Normally, I investigated events in and around and outside of Arkham that appeared to be paranormal, but could be explained through scientific methods. In the November of 1928, there was an incident at the Caverloft Plantation. A group of people, whom according to our investigation were part of a secret cult society referred to as the Order of the Ninth Scorpion, were found completely slaughtered in the sub-level basement of the house. This, in and of itself, is bizarre, as the plantation is located just outside of Keaton's Marsh, a place where the water table is elevated, making it nigh impossible for there to be a below-ground architecture. The bodies belonging to the cult, including that of Quentin Caverloft, the owner of the plantation and the house's namesake, were found mutilated beyond recognition. Out of 126 bodies, only 3 could be successfully identified. These bodies were of Quentin Caverloft, Jeffrey Beavers, and Isaac Graves. Caverloft was found to have died due to a large object being plunged into his abdomen. The wound was inflicted as to not be instantly lethal. Jeffrey Beaver's neck was snapped. Autopsy reports indicate that immense force was exerted upon his neck. Death would have been a slow affair. The death of Isaac Graves could not be determined. The only way Graves could be identified was through his dental records and wedding ring. The DCPR was contacted by the Oakershott Police Department after no rational conclusion could be reached. Thus, I was assigned to the investigation. They had hoped that I could find a logical reason behind the slaughter. I could not. I arrived in Oakershott on the morning of January 3rd, 1929. The air was fairly cool, and the city was still in celebration for having only recently entered the new year. The locals were somewhat friendly, though a fair few were suspicious of my presence. They had heard about the mass murder at the Caverloft Plantation and wanted nothing to do with it. The rumors surrounding that place seemed to focus mainly on ritual human sacrifice. Their hypothesis was not incorrect, as there were several bones and the smell of decomposition uncovered in a sealed alcove within the impossible sub-level basement. Understandably, they were apprehensive of my investigation, as the superstitious Southerners were completely convinced that this unpleasant problem had taken care of itself. I had inquired this, as no official statements surrounding their deaths had been released. There were several theories surrounding the fact that the Order of the Ninth Scorpion had summoned something that they could not control, something that went far beyond their way of thinking. When I had questioned about the theories encompassing what the Order had brought into this world, I had been given a vague answer. The bartender I had been speaking with had shown little concern for what had taken place. "I don't know what happened back there. Don't reckon I ever will," he spoke with a southern drawl. "I don't have any idea what they called into this world. A wrathful demon, an avenging angel, and something else entirely. All I know is that those rotten bastards got exactly what they deserved, offering up random people like that. I don't know exactly what they were up to in that house, but I do know that several people started disappearing when they were around. After that night, the night when all those strange-looking rats started showing up, you know, the weird ones that giggle, people stopped disappearing. Another thing I do know is that the day they showed up, that was the day people started vanishing. Then, when they all died, no more new missing men and women. I don't know why you're bothering to investigate. In fact, I'd advise against it. Clearly, this issue resolved itself clean and simple. But if you still want to go poking your nose where it don't need to be, why don't you go talk to Madame Rose? She's something of an expert on these occult kind of things, but be careful, she's a wily one." The bartender smiled gleefully. Despite the bartender's insistence that the nightmare was over and that the case should be left alone, I did not agree, God help me. I continued to inquire if anyone had personally known any members of the cult. None of them had. However, they all pointed out a Madame Rose to be the one to talk to if I was investigating occurrences of supernatural origin. Afterward, I had done a fair amount of research on this Madame Rose. Madame Rose was a so-called root doctor. Highly respected in the community of Oakershot, she gave out medicine and herbal remedies to her patrons and curses to those she saw fit. Lucky for me, she was not prone to such behavior so long as you did not anger her. From my research, she had a secret place for all the lucky men in the far back of her store. Her store was on Roy and Jean Street, 3 doors down the left of the antique shop. After concluding my research, I decided to pay Madame Rose a visit. I stood outside the hoodoo shop belonging to a much-spoken-about individual by the name of Madame Rose. I gathered my courage, took hold of the door handle, and stepped inside the building. The interior of Madame Rose's shop was dimly lit. From what I could make out were dusty herbs and odd-looking skulls. Upon closer inspection, I made note of the fact that the skulls were made from wax, yet they were not candles. Several stuffed birds adorned the walls, and I thought I could make out a small bottle of absinthe. I was violently brought back to the present by the voice of a southern woman.
Pastor George, if you don't get your little honey out of my store, I will not hesitate to tell your wife what you really come down here for in the middle of the blessed night.
I spun around to behold a short African lady. She wore a head wrap with intricate designs colored with a deep red. Around her neck were several beaded necklaces. Some were colored a brilliant turquoise, while others were made up from tiny skulls. She wore a tattered shawl around her shoulders. Her eyes widened, and after a few seconds, she broke out into a large smile.
Oh, I am sorry, Cher. I thought you were someone else. Well, do come in and I'll fix you a nice hot cup of something, and you just sit down right over there.
Her eyes glittered brightly in the darkened building as she went rushing into the back of the store. I quietly walked towards the small lounge area. There was a table lamp and 2 armchairs, all covered with a thin patina of dust. I blew off most of the dust from one of the seats and sat in it. It was surprisingly comfortable. A few moments later, the woman I presumed to be Madame Rose handed me a cup filled with what appeared to be tea, but smelled of onion.
I do apologize for that greeting you had to experience. I hardly get any new customers, and the only one I have is just a little too entitled. He's starting to become a real irritation.
I ventured to guess. Pastor George? Madame Rose's face lit up.
Yes, Cher, that's the one. He's always trying to get a look at my secret place for the lucky ones, but I just don't feel right on him being a pastor, let alone being married.
I thought it a bit unusual that a hoodoo priestess would have a moral issue with a pastor attending her secret speakeasy and/or brothel. I decided to err on the side of caution and begin my inquiries concerning the Caverloft Plantation.
Oh, that place,
Madame Rose said into her cup with a disgusted tone.
That place's history is as covered with blood as the hands of its master. Lord Quentin Caverloft was a dirty bastard in life as he probably is in death. That man was so wicked the devil probably don't want him for fear of losing control of hell. She chuckled mirthlessly. I once tried to put roots on that man, but it's like something was protecting him. It's like he just got more powerful.
I raised my brow. Put roots? Madame Rose nodded.
I tried to curse him.
I nodded in understanding. You said that place's history is covered with blood. What did you mean by that? Madame Rose took a sip of her drink.
Do you mind if I smoke?
I shook my head. Rose nodded, and then, before my eyes, began to roll herself her own cigarette.
What do you know so far, Cher?
She asked me. Well, I do know the Caverloft Plantation was built just before the Civil War. Rose nodded.
Yeah. What else do you know?
I shook my head. That's about it. Madame Rose leaned back into her chair and nodded.
During the year of 1857, Elias Caverloft had commissioned construction of his plantation. He had come over from Europe and had brought all his trappings and belongings with him. After he had the house built just outside side of what we now call Keaton's Marsh. That was 1860. He settled down and his wife gave birth to a son.
I listened intently.
Now, during construction, the slaves would peek in through the windows of the house and say that Elias was doing strange things, reading from a strange book bound in a strange leather. One of those slaves just happened to be my grandmama. She said that after Elias did those strange things, the house would come to life.
My brow arched. Come to life? I asked. Rose nodded.
You go inside and open a door, and 1 minute there would be a grand parlor, and the next time you open that same door, there'd be a sheer drop-off into frigid water. There would be doors that led to rooms that should not have existed. Rooms that went against the construction of the house.
I interrupted her story to tell her something. There was a sub-level basement at the plantation. That was where we found all the bodies. Madame Rose nodded her head.
So my grandmama was right. She would have to be considering the fact that you can't have a lower level in a house that was built in the bayou.
She chuckled. She continued her story.
Well, skip ahead a couple of years to 1859, and that was when tragedy struck.
She took a long drag from a cigarette and blew out a long trail of smoke.
Now, I'm going to try and tell this the way my grandmama told it. One of the slaves, someone who had taken interest into what Elias was doing, snuck into the house and stole the strange book. All through the night, strange sounds would come from his tent. All the other slaves tried their best to get some sleep. Now, the next morning, everyone was awoken by a scream. They all came running out of their tents and saw something which brought my grandmama to tears.
I leaned forward, savoring her every word.
What they saw was horrid. The man that stole the book, his eyes were gone. He was covered in his own blood from head to toe. Strange symbols had been carved into his body, blood oozing from every one. His tongue was torn out, and it was later found burning in the small fire he had built the night before. He was muttering some strange language that was made to sound even stranger due to his tongue being missing. But I think the worst thing of all was the fact that behind him was the body of another slave, except this one was badly mutilated. His belly had been torn open and his entrails covered the ground. There was a strange little statue made from mud. It was crudely made, but it was made to resemble one of those things, the ones with the tentacles.
I nodded as I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a photograph. It depicted a small idol, dedicated to a deity, that was referred to by most cults as Cthulhu. Like this? I asked her, pulling the photo up. She gasped and put her hand to her mouth. She choked out a response.
That's damn near exactly what she had described.
I began to explain that this creature, and others like it, were worshipped by insane men and women in strange rituals and blood sacrifices. I also informed her that the book Madame Rose's grandmother referred to may have been an accursed tome known as the Necronomicon. This book is said to have spells and instructions for horrid summons and reality-bending curses. The book was said to have been bound in human skin. Madame Rose nodded in understanding.
Yeah, that seems about right.
What happened next? I pressed on for further details. Madame Rose shook her head.
That's really all I know.
I nodded.
I try to avoid that place myself. From what I can tell, that house is still alive. You do best to avoid it.
I stepped out of Madame Rose's store, feeling nauseous. The world around me was spinning, and the air tasted rancid. I don't know if it was the gruesome details of her story, and the strange tea, or both, but it felt like I had to lie down for a while before my body decided to further revolt against me. I went back into Madame Rose's store and requested a place to lie down for a while. My flight into Okershot had been long and arduous, and I was desperate to get some rest. Madame Rose held no objections and led me to a small mattress in another room. As I lay my head down, I felt the quickly approaching sleep that so evaded me on the plane. I glanced at the clock that sat on the small bedside table to my left. 1:34 p.m. As I closed my eyes, I felt the mortal world slip away from me, and I fell into a deep sleep.